Greetings and welcome to Liminal Light, a show that explores the languages of myth and lore, sky and star, earth and embodiment through astrology, art, and spirit engagement. I'm your host, Chris. Enjoy. Okay, hello and welcome back to the show. Today we have astrologer and card reader Diana Rose with us. How you doing, Diana?
I'm pretty good. Just drinking some tea.
Nice. Yeah, I'm hopefully caffeinated enough. We started pretty early, so trying to get with the first wave of caffeine of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
So we have been trying to record this conversation for a while now, so I'm really happy that we finally are here and the tape is rolling, the proverbial tape. Before we get going, do you want to let people know what your practice is like and who you are?
Yeah. I am a tarot reader. I'm an astrologer. I'm also an energy worker. I have a background in clinical massage therapy and French literature. And
very important detail. That's totally.
Yeah, actually, it's pretty relevant.
Yeah, for sure.
My practice is something that I've been kind of accepting and stepping into over the past, two-ish, three-ish years. But it has a deep history where, as a kid, as a really little kid, I was playing with cards. Around 5 is when I was first introduced to cards as a divination tool. It was one of those it was a Native American animal spirit deck kind of thing. And then I bought my first tarot deck with my Dandelion pulling allowance money for Barnes & Noble when I was 8, which has been really interesting because Dandelion has been coming up regularly over the past couple of years as I've taken this practice even deeper and brought it out brought it out of the broom closet into the world,
Yeah.
Dandelion has continued to be a friend with that process, which I found interesting. I don't know how much I want to necessarily get in. I don't know how much I should get into the history component, personal history component. But thinking about what my practice is now, which is constantly shifting. It's always growing. I'm always learning new things and deepening things already known. But my practice tends to be one that takes people into places where they've, the bluntest way to put it is where they've been lying to themselves about something, whether or not they're aware of it, and taking them to a place of seeing better what actually is, and that being a really liberatory place to be, because when you can acknowledge things for as they currently are, or as they have been, it's a lot easier to have firm ground whenever you're stepping forward.
That's a really great way to put it. Is that something that you ever say to clients if they seem open to that phrasing?
Sort of. That's actually, that phrasing literally just came to me now because I was just how do I summarize this?
Yeah. No, it's brilliant.
In the past, I've described it in terms of helping people into a place of greater integrity.
Yeah.
But I feel like the concept of integrity can be kind of vague or moralistic. And kind of rabid self-honesty is maybe a bit more accurate, where it's sometimes it can feel you're getting dragged on something, but it's really just, hey, let's stop pretending, so that way you can actually be fully who you are and care fully about what you actually care about, and stop spinning your wheels in a muddy place on a road that's not even taking you someplace you want to go, you know?
Yeah, totally.
So
yeah, that's really helpful, you know, because it comes that moment in client consultation where you're kind of like looking at what's in front of you and you're like, all right, what's going on here? And it's kind of confrontational. You know?
Sorry. Yeah. It can feel a little bit confronting, especially, you know, anybody who does these sorts of practices, you know, will every now and then get a client that is really just not receptive to how you work. Right. And it's always really interesting for me when that happens, because it helps me to actually clarify what it is that I'm doing and like what it is that I excel at whenever I'm in these client sessions. Cause it's like, I'm not going to handhold you through continuing to lie to yourself. And I'm not going to be, you know, I'm careful with my words, but I'm not dishonest with them. So if there's something hard that needs to be said, you know, I'm not necessarily going to say the thing that will crack you into pieces, because that's not nice.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's only so much sugarcoating that's actually helpful. Like if it's so sugarcoated that your stomach can't break down the shell to get to the medicine, then it's too much sugarcoating. Right.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, I mean, and it's like that whole like getting honest with what's actually going on. Like that's true for tarot. That's true for astrology. That's true in my energy work practice. Whenever, like, I haven't really been doing much body work recently, but it's true in body work too, where it's just like, yeah, if you continue to not deal with your stress, you're going to continue to have intense neck pain. And it's not just a problem with your muscles. It's actually a problem with how you address stress, you know? So
yeah, totally.
Like that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not exactly, you know, like if in bodywork it might be more so, but sometimes like with astrology or with tarot or any divination that you're doing, it's not exactly therapy. And for some people it more is, like they're trained that way. But for others, it's like, okay, I'm the reader, you know, and I'm trying to help you by looking into this web of synchronicities or these significators and indicators, you know, and it's like the sessions can be therapeutic, but they're doing something different than just therapy. You know, they're like, we're not doctors usually, you know, like,
right.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you said about the dandelion too, actually, because yesterday, people will know from previous episodes, my podcast partner, Bonnie, yesterday brought me over to this like shadowy area in the brush, and she'd been talking about it. And she's like, there are these huge dandelion greens under here, and like kind of jungled me into this area and like revealed them underneath. And so they were just like these like kind of giant dandelion greens that before I saw them, she was like, yeah, it's like, you know, when you buy dandelion greens from like organic dandelion greens, they're this big, but you never usually see them this big. And I don't know, it's just interesting to like right before speaking to you and you mentioning the dandelion that like I like got like this kind of like dandelion like revelation, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and like dandelions, they're supportive in detoxification, right?
Yeah.
Which I think, oh man, this is interesting. I was just having this conversation yesterday around like, it was like part of a chart exchange situation that's going on. And like showing up in a way that's, how do I put this? Breaking down rules that are harmful so that rules that are useful and like strengthening can take precedence, right? And so it's like thinking about these practices of, you know, I think especially with astrology and supporting people in like stepping into the map that they're born with instead of trying to mush themselves into the shape that an oppressive society might demand of them, right? There is kind of this detoxification of conditioning that can happen whenever astrology is wielded in a way that facilitates full becoming versus trying to just operate well enough inside of a sick society.
Yeah. It reminds me of like habituation, like in Ayurveda, say, like if you're, like alcohol is not recommended, but like they don't really recommend quitting things cold turkey. Like it's too dangerous, So like, you're like, oh yeah, you're probably going to do better on that than off that for now, and like, as you start to kind of disengage from something that's harming you, that like it's your body starts to do things that need a lot of processing,
Yeah, totally. That's so interesting. And also that reminds me, do you want to talk about the cards that you pulled? Because for some reason that's just recalling back to those for me right now.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. So I pulled some cards for right before we started talking, because we were going to be talking about divination in general, like what it is, how does it work, and especially as, two people that are card readers and astrologers, and why is that different? Why is it similar? Where's the overlap? And where's like divination possibly going at this point in time? And so I just kind of pulled some cards before we talked that I'll put the image up somewhere, like with the podcast or on the YouTube video, so people can see it if they want. But asking the cards, like, what story of themselves do they want told, was kind of my question. And so I tend to pull in 3 categories, like a loose past, present, future, just to kind of get an itinerary, like a narrative going. And then I'll pull in each pile until I hit a major arcana. So I get at the bottom, I get like a root, and at the top, I get an archetype, and in between, I get details. And so the first one I pulled is the Tower card. And so I kind of just was thinking about like a random mutation kind of exploding out of nowhere, kind of like, jumping out of the crucible once things are ready to, and kind of like the cat's out of the bag, like whatever tarot is or whatever cartomancy is comes out of nowhere. And then because when we look back through history, we're like, yeah, we can trace it back to here. And then it's kind of like, well, still, how did this really happen? And then after that, the next category, the root, is the 4 of coins. And so it's like, okay, well, now they're a thing. They physically exist, say, as cards, or even like really early cards were circular, like early, like I think the playing cards first appeared in Europe in the last quarter of the 14th century. The earliest European reference is we speak of like a Saracen or a Moorish game called Naive. And then the first like complete Mamluk Egyptian deck of 52 cards, distinct in Oriental designs, survived around the same time with like the 4 suits, the swords, polo sticks, cups, and coins. And so some of the early ones are even round. And then, okay, so we have like these things that exist as a game, as cards. And then above that, I get like the king of coins, and he's inverted, and the queen of coins above that, and she's inverted. So people are like, they're scheming, they're wheeling and dealing with these things. They're gambling. They're like passing them around. He's kind of like a merchant king. So it's that kind of like mercurial environment, like of goods and gambling, and kind of the crossroads of like, say, like the Silk Road or something. And then the queen, they're really trying to like possess these things, and maybe even starting to look at them in a slightly divinatory way, like just because they're sortilege. Then we get the 9 of cups above that. Passions are really high, emotions really high. These games probably happen in like places similar to like pubs, or like people are drinking, they're drunk, like they're getting emotionally invested, they're winning money, they're losing money. It gets like people like filling up their resources or emptying out their resources. It's like turbulent, it's uneven. And then we get the Queen of Cups, people kind of trying to like control that whole situation. They're really emotionally invested. Maybe they're starting to be manipulative, but they're also trying to like watch themselves and watch others around them. And then we get the Devil card above that. We get this whole scene kind of painted, and we see that the emotional investment becomes obsession, and at that point, like entities can walk in, like tarot maybe at that point gets haunted, you know. And then the next section we get sort of now or the future, and at the bottom we get the Ace of Swords, and so it's a tool, and it's a tool to articulate and kind of discern intellectually what's going on. Then we get the Page of Wands, not really knowing what you're doing, not really knowing what to do with your creativity and with your energies and ideas and impulses, and not really knowing where to go with things. Then we get the King of Cups, inverted, poorly managing or not managing your world emotionally. Then we get the Three of Wands, like germinating energies, like new energies coming in, new things happening. And then above that, we get the Nine of Swords, too many things to think about at once. So that like stress and like kind of whirling thoughts. And so I see from here, like kind of trying to find articulation and use the tarot as a tool through those kinds of situations of being confused, you know, about your life in various ways. And at the top of that, we get Arcana 13, the Death card. And so ultimately that could be summed up in like sweeping changes in life, and how do we articulate and discern through the muck of a sweeping change, and kind of like step forward and move on into like whatever the new phase of life is going to be after a divination session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so perfect. It's so good. And so what's so interesting with that, like as I was mentioning to you before we started recording, like I don't use the Marseille tradition. And so there are differences in meaning between the kind of different traditions of tarot. But what is interesting is that, like, as I was glancing at these cards and thinking about how I would read them, even without knowing ahead of time exactly how you structure these kinds of readings, got a very similar read, right? And like I really love I don't know. It's just like there's a big bang, and then there's stuff, and the stuff.
Yeah, right.
One of the things that was maybe a little different. Like I was thinking about the Devil card, not just in terms of like how you were talking about it, but also in terms of how tarot has been literally demonized. Right?
Yeah, totally.
Not only is it also kind of haunted, but it is also something that a lot of people consider like evil. It's like, you know, joking that it's a tool of the devil, which is not actually a problem.
Right. And that's kind of what I was saying is that's essentially, at least, especially in that worldview at that time, is true, right? Like you're like,
yeah,
if it's the 1400s and you're like, well, these things can tell you your future. And you're like, well, the devil is working that one. And you're like, you know, from that time period, there's no one saying like, well, that's untrue. That's absolutely true. So they sort of like just the capability of them meeting up with the superstition around them. It's like, it literally opened the door for like full haunting, you know?
Yeah.
And that's like the thing that mirrors that in the next column. Is the other thing about the Death card is like, oh, since they became haunted at some point, now we can use them as like a tool of necromancy as well, you know?
Yeah. Like speaking beyond the veil through the cards, which that's actually really interesting, because that's been something that's been a theme in readings that I've been giving over the past, I don't know, I guess pretty much a year. It's been a consistent theme. I think ever since, honestly, probably since just before the nodes moved into the Cancer Capricorn axis. And just like people's ancestors being like through readings being like, hi, hello,
totally.
attention. And it's I actually wanted to talk with you a little bit about this. So like the folks that I work with, like I am not usually one to be like, I I don't consider myself a medium necessarily. Like I can tell with cards, like whether like there's an ancestral, like, hey, pay attention. But there's not necessarily a, like, your grandmother or your great great grandmother on your mom's side really wants you to blah blah blah. Like that's not part of how readings happen through me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally.
Which is interesting because I think I've also been working with people who, if I were to be like your grandmother, blah, 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 it would actually shut them down from paying attention to whatever else is happening in the cards. And so one of the questions that I actually wanted to ask you about is like that, like working with cards as these tools for communicating not just what's happening inside an individual person, but also what's happening for them inside of the, I don't know, like spirit swirl that they exist within. Like how does the swirl translate through readings for you?
Well, it's in a couple different ways. Like I kind of always involve spirits of the dead in my readings, you know, like if I'm going to read, I'll kind of approach like a few different spirits and tell them what I'm doing, tell them who I'm reading for, if possible, kind of like pass the deck, give them an offering, pass the deck by a candle for them, have like a back and forth. And like some are like ancestors, some are dead of cartomancy in general, you know, and some are not even human, you know, and then kind of say like, when I shuffle the cards, it's your deal, you know? And so you're the one who's going to select the cards for the client, like not me. And you're welcome to like whisper into my ear as I read, you know? And so often I attribute accuracy, like partially to them, you know, then like, well, this is like you're saying through the veil, this is happening. And so I kind of always take that approach. But if I wanted to kind of contact a specific spirit or specific dead, it's sort of just so sensitized to that kind of thing that you just kind of like invite them, whatever methods of mediumship or spirit contact you use, and then kind of say like, you know, like kind of create a calm environment and a sensitive environment and say, hey, we're going to start chatting back and forth, and we have this on the table. We can use this, you know, and let it kind of come out. And that's an explicit example, like just kind of start shuffling the cards, start putting them out and see if that communication's happening. And then there's like various methods of like kind of assessing whether or not through like even odd binaries and things like that, like 4 coins or 6 coins or 5 coins, say, whether or not you're getting yes or no answers, that's like starts to make sense that like you're talking back and forth, or if it just sounds like more noise than signal, you know?
Yeah.
And kind of test to like if there's a dialogue happening, like if it were a Ouija board, it would just be spelling everything out. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
right. Or if it were like a pendulum with a pendulum mat or something like that.
Right. Yeah. And I use pendulum a lot, and then I'll kind of ask spirits whether they want to communicate through cards or not. And some are like, no, get those out of here, you know? And then, and then others are like, yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. And then they kind of fall into my repertoire of like who I do cards with, you know?
Yeah, totally. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. That's like, that's, you know, as I was mentioning earlier, you know, the process of coming out of the broom closet, so to speak, has been an interesting one, because it's not just like coming out in terms of like sharing with the wider public. Like these are things that I am really super interested in, and that I have been like secretly dorking out about on my own for a while. And like, now I'm going to talk about it in public, right? It's not just that, it's also been a process of like it's interesting. Like, do you listen to Jessica Lanyadu's Ghost of a Podcast?
No, I haven't heard it.
Okay. It's really interesting. I mean, she's brilliant. But she did one recently where she was talking, like somebody, it was like a Pride Month sort of thing. And somebody was writing in about being hesitant about coming out as queer because they didn't want people thinking about their sex life, basically. And one of the things that like Jessica was talking about is how whenever you come out, it's not just about whether people know who you like to have sex with. It's also like letting yourself be yourself without hiding parts of yourself. And like whenever you're hiding one part of yourself, there's a high chance that you are also hiding other parts of yourself or not letting yourself fully step into other parts. Which I found really interesting because like I have been finding that to be true with the whole coming out of the broom closet thing, where like not only am I just more comfortable talking about the things that I was already interested in, but more things that are related to what I was already interested in are coming into my life, and like different ways of doing what I was already interested in have been forming.
Oh yeah,
right?
Totally.
And so even just thinking about like, you know, giving myself like space and permission to do communication with like the non-embodied, like that's come from giving myself permission to even just like be a person who does cards in public.
Right. Yeah.
And I know you've been doing like, I'm sorry, I feel like now I've suddenly co-opted this podcast.
No, it's fine. Yeah, however it goes. Yeah.
But like I have been curious to talk with people who either didn't have like a broom closet exit or have been out of it for so long that it's just like, well, this is just who I am. Like for me personally, like I'm really interested in that, like, you know, being a magical person in the world publicly. Like, I don't know what the like accessory question to that is.
Right. No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. And yeah, it's weird. There's like a thin line, like, even just explaining my process of, or part of it with like, you know, speaking with spirits and through sortilege, it was like, it's kind of tender. I was like, should I be saying this? Cause I still am into like ritual secrecy. And I think it like amplifies what you're doing, and it like, creates an appropriate amount of echo so that like the transmission actually happens, where sometimes if it's too open, it's like the channel's too open and you're not going to get as much in like, the volume will be really low on the voice or something. So, but I kind of consider, you know, at this point, whoever's listening to this podcast, like it's not, you know, it's not hugely popular at this point. So it's like whoever's listening to it is like, they're not accidentally, you know what I mean? It's like they
know what they're getting into when they're
we're in conversation, you know, like, but at the same time, yeah, like there's something weird about like like just being very public about what you do and not like, I don't really tell everyone what I'm up to, but like, I don't hide it if they ask, you know, and then depending on where I'm at, you know, like, what kind of social situation I'm in, it's very, very public. And I grew up with this stuff. So it's like always been up front. Like I never thought of it any other way. I never thought of it as I never had to come to grips with it. It just like existed, you know, and like, and it was always really clear to me that people had no belief in it or no idea of like what I was talking about, you know, like from a young age, you know, and it was just got used to that idea. And then there were people that you'd encounter who just were really ready to hear more, you know?
Yeah.
Which I think, like, you know, now that for a lot of people it's going very public, it creates a space for it to become normal, to certain elements of things to become normal to a degree that they can kind of be open and operative and usable and start kind of like a regular pattern but also a lot of things that might get pulled out of secrecy into the light, like make them ineffective at the same time. So it's kind of like, it's a real hard thing about like it's never been like this before. You know what I mean? Like it's always, even in pre-Christian times, like in like classical antiquity, the people doing necromancy would be on the outskirts and in the liminal zones of society. You know, it's like because you didn't want the dead freely mixing with the living. You know, so it's
Right.
like becoming really public diviners and necromancers is kind of an awkward, strange thing to be happening for. You're like, well, what does this really say about the society as a whole? Because they're not really ready to digest what we might all be bringing to the table, like so openly, even though it's nice to be more embraced than usual, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that actually, what's interesting, one thing that I've observed at least is that when people reach a certain level of publicness or popularity, they actually stop being like one-to-one diviners. Right.
Mm.
And they actually kind of switch over into teaching the skill.
Yeah.
Instead of like doing it, like in the way that maybe they were at first. And I think that is an interesting thing to think about when we consider like what comes through, what comes through as you develop greater intimacy with these practices, and what can you actually do publicly that is keeping those practices in integrity, I guess, while also keeping yourself safe.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think like especially tarot, like when we were saying about like what is the spirit swirl that like how does that, what's the structure of that or whatever, or like what's the definition of that? I think they're all like the dead are always speaking through the cards just because of like the history of the cards themselves. So many hands shuffled these cards and so many people put so much projection into them, and that's how we ended up with a lot of the meanings that we have, you know, and that they always have a say. I mean, just that you're going into a divinatory state when you're throwing them down and just reading what chance says about how you put the cards down, that instantly opens up a space for like whoever to speak through, you know, and like, and with astrology too. I mean, we're always at like astrology is much more structured and technical, and there's like a community and it's very professional, but like, but we're always sort of like tapping on the shoulder of the dead astrologers who came before and asking them to teach us how to do it, you know, and like, they're always going to talk and I don't know, kind of coming into terms with that's what we're doing. That's what everyone's doing all the time, even as like a chef or something, you know, like, and like you said, like there is like safety and not safety. Because like whenever the dead are allowed to just like come up to the mic and say whatever they want and kind of like grab the wheel, like things can go off the rails, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so interesting.
And I think that's like, you know, a lot of the problems in people's lives, like you said, like tend to be them lying to themselves. And some part of that within there sometimes for a lot of people, and it's not like the important piece always. And some people it is more so. You'll identify that it is an ancestor thing or it is some sort of haunting where it's sort of them lying to themselves, but there might be someone else down the line that's like contributing to that lie. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things where, like, I think a lot of my work ends up being not removing responsibility, but turning down the dial on I'm wrong for people. Right? It's like, oh, I personally am at fault for this thing. And it's just like, can we just like step away from the shoulds and the shames for a second so we can actually see what's going on? And I feel like the shoulds and the shames are often, they often mask the fact that whatever someone is carrying that's too heavy is not like they didn't pick it up.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's something that's been being passed down, or foisted upon, versus like, oh yeah, you actively, consciously chose to be this way, to lie to yourself in this way. Right. But,
yeah, which is like, it's just kind of like the stories we tell ourselves, right? You know, or that are told to us. And then, and it's possible, I think about this a lot now, and it comes up with other forms of divination too, that like reality to, in one sense, is just stories, you know, and you were talking about like how, helpful it is, like having like a degree in French literature, you know, like it's like that narrative, like intimacy is like really important as like, as a diviner, you know, the ability to like recognize patterns and see storylines and see narratives. And that those are often like how we get ourselves into trouble, is like ending up in the wrong story, you know, and that like the tarot like really explicitly just throws like a narrative together in front of you that you can kind of see your own story in, but then see an alternate story and see like divides in the story and kind of like ways to break it up. It's like, it just brims with like recognition, but also contrast and like allies and enemies, you know, like, and how the two like modulate each other, like helps to like kind of pull, like kind of rescue the parts that you want to save, and allows you like a place to kind of like release or destroy the parts that you want to shed, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually speaks to one of the things that I really appreciate about tarot, which is that because their story is through pictures, right? Like there's that, there's a like conscious mind knowing that will happen on the part of the client as soon as they see the cards.
Yeah.
Right? And so, like the process of reading is more a process of guiding someone along the path that is already like laid out visually through the cards, versus just, I don't know, it's not making up a story, it's guiding a story, if that makes any sense. Like,
yeah, totally. Yeah.
Like I think about, for example, like I think about the hermit, right? Which is so frequently depicted with a lamp, right? And like the lamp, like shining that illumination onto onto whatever is being displayed. Like that's pretty much the role of the reader.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the casting of light. And I think there's something to helping people see the things that they then can't unsee.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, like pulling. Yeah, like you said, like in the very beginning, like what are you lying to yourself about? Like kind of like yeah, we should be revelatory. You know, like we're like, it's like whether or not it's like a future prediction, because that's like that gets really sketchy in a way, and it depends on the reading. And then I can almost tell sometimes now when doing a tarot reading for someone, or doing another form of divination like sortilege or spirit contact kind of divination for someone, like what transits they're currently having, you know, by how the reading comes out. Like if they're having Pluto transits, like the information just gets so murky, and just like I'll be like, I don't know what to tell you. It's just like, there's no way to like really see like further than like where we're at right now, like for a variety of reasons. And like, this person must be having a Pluto transit. And sometimes I get to check and I'm like, yep, totally. You know,
yeah.
like so people's futures, like, or the ability to make future predictions, change for everyone, you know, and sometimes they're like spot on. Sometimes it's going to be 50-50. Sometimes it's going to be like only in symbols or metaphors. Sometimes it's like, oh no, you will like you will do better economically this year than last year. And like, you know, like it's all over the place. And like, it's hard to say any which way, but what you are revealing is just things that spread into the future, into the past, and into the present that for one reason or another have like a bunch of dirt thrown over them or like a blanket thrown over it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Or it's just like just out of peripheral vision. Right? Yeah.
I want to go back like just a couple clicks here and like kind of just go through these notes that I put together of like the history of tarot, just to kind of like be like, okay, this is like kind of some things we do with it or how it operates, but like how weird it is that this is the thing that we use to do that with. As I was saying, like the playing cards first appeared in Europe in the last quarter of the 14th century. As like Saracen or Moorish games, and there's like a deck that came up through Egypt that was a 52 card deck, and it had the swords, their polo sticks rather than wands, cups, and coins, and then they had ranks of king, governor, second governor, and like 1 to 10 cards, and then those are kind of directly what influenced the Spanish decks and the Portuguese decks and the Italian regional playing card decks that are different than the 4-suit 52 card deck that we use. The numbers change, and then they have sometimes they lack queens, and instead like they have multiple ranks of like of kings, like this king, governor, second governor, and then we get another thread other than just the playing cards themselves of coming from depictions of Roman victory processions, like kind of parades that they would after they would have a successful military victory, and they'd have these great parades, and they started to get put into poems. Like Petrarch wrote a poem called Triumphi in 1374, and this is like where we get the art of like, you see it in tapestries and in murals of like, it'll be titled like the Triumph of Love, and it'll be this great procession that's kind of like as if like this one of the Roman victory processions was love won out over everything else, or the triumph of justice, or and then we start to get the archetypes that later pour into tarot. You see these a lot in Venice and like the d'Este estate murals. And they became very popular that they started depicting them in smaller and smaller plates until eventually they started being showing up as card games. And the earliest known use of the word triumphi in relation to cards can be dated to 1440. And in the records of a Florentine notary, Giusto Giusti, and he recorded a transaction where he transferred 2 expensive personalized decks to one Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, which is interesting because the name Malatesta basically means like sick in the head, and so like that's just maybe like when we're looking in the tarot reading, we're like, I don't know, something happened. People are using these cards. They got obsessed. They got crazy, So the earliest known appearance of the word tarocco as a new name for the game is from Brescia around 1502. And the author Rabelais speaks of a tarot. He spells it Tarau, and also a game called Triumph. The role of the fool in the game was to excuse the player from following suit. So you wouldn't have to it's kind of like the wild card. You'd be like, oh, there's clubs down. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's kind of like an Uno, actually, where you can.
Yeah, totally. The fool is like the Uno for sure. Is the most, and that was the most unique feature that separated the old game of Triumpha, and that's might be where we get the word tarot from tarocco, because in modern Italian the singular term tarocco is a noun which means a type of blood orange, but they'll use it as an adjective to mean like fake or counterfeit, and a similar version of the word was used in previous Italian and regional Italian to just denote a fool, someone who's being a fool, and being like fake or counterfeit makes sense for the fool in the game, as it's like he doesn't have to follow suit. He kind of can do these fake outs,
Right.
and then the high card order and suit shifting, like all the like which card is higher, which card's lower, which suits which, like changed a lot during the Italian Wars, which bring the games and the decks to France, and that's where we get the Marseille deck, which is like the most reprinted and reimagined deck, like throughout hundreds of years, until the Golden Dawn gets interested, and eventually we get the Rider-Waite-Smith deck published in 1909. And then things really kind of go a completely different direction, but also take off like crazy from there.
Yeah, that's the haywire.
Yeah,
the haywire beginning. Yeah,
right. So it's crazy to think of, you know, how much of a game it was, even though there's evidence of people using it much differently than a game at the same time. But, you know, they were games, they were paintings, they were stories, they were like kind of like these echoes of historical events and like celebrations of victories, and then it kind of comes together in this thing, and where the images come from, like, you know, the Golden Dawn and you know, everything that came out in that school that came after would talk about how there's all these secret hermetic symbols like hidden in there, but it's probably less the case than that they're just human stories from a time when everyone was in an astrological paradigm, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. It's interesting to think about like how we understand divination to be kind of like this special spoopy thing, right? But to think back to like a time when like spoopy was just kind of part of being alive.
Yeah, totally.
So at Norwalk, one of the lectures that I really enjoyed was Sean Nygaard's talk on the sixth house. And one of the things that he brought up in that is this concept of entre chien et loup, which is like this French phrase describing twilight, when, you know, before like electric lights and like that kind of thing. It's like you're walking around outside and the sun's going down and you're like, shit, I gotta get home. You see a canine in the distance and you can't tell if it's a wolf or a dog.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And just thinking about if like that's just your day to day, you know, it's not just a like, oh man, the whole city's power went out and there was totally a coyote in the middle of town, right? Like that's a special occurrence. But if it's not a special occurrence, then there's an embeddedness of like uncertainty and like magic in both the positive and the like ominous sense that's just baked into being alive.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, and like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, the leap between a game and a divination would be a lot shorter in that kind of context.
For sure. Yeah. And if, like, say the power went out in the city and you were like, is that a dog or a coyote? And then you get closer and you're, you know, it's occupying some thoughts and some mind space. And then you're like, oh, no, it is a dog, you know, and there is a fear response. But then you, like, go where you're going and you walk into a friend's house and they're doing this crazy painting of a coyote, you know, you no longer throw out the coyote, you know, like you're like, oh, but yeah, that's kind of off topic, but like, yeah, totally. From the game to the divination is so close because you don't know if you're going to win or lose the game. And you kind of even start reading the game to figure that out, you know, like you start like kind of using synchronicities. You're like, oh, every time I get this kind of spread, I end up losing or I end up winning. And you can like make choices, or it's not that hard to start thinking about like making decisions about the person on the other side of the table based on kind of what cards are falling down on the table. It starts to happen really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just like the assessment of cheating, for example.
Yeah, right. Totally.
Right? It's like the kind of awareness that you have to have of not just like the cards in your hands, but the things that are going on around the cards in order to be a good card player, right? It's not that far of a leap from being a good cartomancer.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And there's a spirit in the grimoire, the Grimorium Verum, who's what she said to provide for you as the magician is to come around the table and tell you what cards the other players are holding in their hand, and also like, but she's also related to like dance and to music. Like she's supposed to be able to like make you hear whatever music you want to hear any old time, or to like, so it's like that kind of like carousal, like mixed with all this, like where things are really getting blurry too, because people tend to drink when there's games, and like you're saying about the Twilight, like things aren't really what they seem.
Yeah, there's a lot that's going on that can't be fully perceived for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's interesting too to think about like what's the risk of divination, right? Where it's like, if we think about like gambling always carries a risk, right? To it. And like, I'm thinking about the punitive nature of like demonizing divination practices, but also thinking about the dedicated discrediting of divination that's happened alongside like more intense levels of oppression, like historically speaking. And like there's like kind of a swirl in my brain that's happening right now, where I'm thinking about like Lucifer and liberation and tricksterness, and what it means when the concept of like knowledge is power is applied to unorthodox or not broadly accepted methods of gaining knowledge.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, on different levels, it spins off a lot of superstitions depending on what is the broader culture that's put in. Anytime someone's like, oh, well, I can get this information just kind of through this other way, through this back door, then whatever culture is set up around that is like, can decide what kind of suspicious that they can be, towards that, like depending on, like our culture might like, well, we need to make up a law like about that, or you can't do that in public, or you can't do that without a permit, whereas another culture might be like, oh, well, you're very dangerous, or that means that you're low class, or that means that you're, that's blasphemy,
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's so interesting.
So I'm wondering about French literature. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah. So, French literature. One of the interesting things. So, I majored in French by accident. Like I didn't do it on purpose. I just tested, like I took French in high school. And then when I came to college, I tested way higher than I thought I would, when they were doing the language placement exams. And so then I was just like taking a French class every single quarter, and ended up with a major that way.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting about like learning a language that's not your native language, especially as like when you're already past the regular like language forming years, is that you can feel how it's changing how you think.
Oh, for sure.
Right. With French in particular, I think one of the things that's interesting is there are so many letters that you don't pronounce, at least in contemporary French. And what's also interesting is that like the French of like the 1400s written is not that crazy different from the French of now. It's not like English where you kind of need to have studied in order to be able to fluidly read what was written, 600-700 years ago, right? And there's how do I put this? There's like an innate poetry in French that really facilitates listening for what's not like actively there, if that makes any sense. Like listening to that which is beyond what is spoken. And this is less about French literature, and this is more about French as a language.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it makes sense. They say like, English is really probably actually like could be considered like a pidgin language. Like it's like 80% like French, Latin grammar, but has like German grammatical structure and just kind of like vacuums up like whatever words it can find. So we have so many different ways to say things that we kind of go through it like without that stop or without that like contemplation.
Yeah, whereas with French there is like a lot of like innate contemplativeness to it, I think. But what's also interesting is like looking at French literature and looking at like French philosophical processes. Like I'm not an expert by any means. But the way that, how do I put this? This is less about language and literature, and this is more about how our structures exploded, right? It's like when we think about like the period of the Enlightenment, or like the period of like the takeover of quote unquote rationalism. Right. And we think about the takedown of monarchy and like that kind of hierarchy. And we think about the kind of murderous utopia that was happening during the French Revolution. How there was like, even within all of that, there was still a poetry to it that as soon as it became English language, revolutionizing, it lost the poetry.
Yeah.
It became a different kind of oppression.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And like, I don't, it's like somebody could argue with me about that and I probably would fall over pretty quickly because I'm just like, I can't cite my sources with that. It's more just like, whenever I look to what I was reading and learning when I was studying like French, and what I was made to learn and read as like an American public school student, right? That's the thing that I kind of observed the most.
Yeah. I mean, I know exactly what you're saying with, there's less deleting, I feel like, with other cultures through their language and through their literature, that like things, whether or not they were, savory or unsavory, like tend to continue to like incorporate themselves into the identity and into the philosophy, like that just kind of, and like poetry gives you the option of putting things at a distance, where they're like kind of part, like they are like a tarot card, like when you look at the death card, it's a very dark looking card, like there's some serious themes there, and there's other cards that present serious themes, but you don't take them out of the deck, like
right.
that, like they're part of the whole, but you don't have to live with them like every moment. They can just be part of a way a language is kind of like poised, or part of how a literature kind of puts something here in a story and something there, but you'll see it come up perennially over and over. Like when we're talking about the dandelions, like things that like plants that grow up in disturbed earth, like grow up in ditches and places that have been poisoned, they have like they're almost like the poetry itself dealing with like the processing of that stuff. And it remains, even if things are passed away,
Yeah, totally. totally. There's, I don't know about like French literature specifically.
But probably studying literature in general is like a assisted you as a diviner, as being basically a storyteller.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just like I'm remembering right now, like there was this, I took a class on Haitian literature. And one of the things that was, the thing that like has stuck with me the most from that little snippet of time, is this concept of, spiritualisme, which was sort of this literary mini movement, around, like trying to break away from the oppression of linear time, basically. Mm-hmm. And so telling stories that were innately sporadic in nature. And they were completely like most trippy things to try to read, especially as a non-native French speaker, and especially with like the incorporation of like Haitian Creole. It's not just French. It's like its own kind of pidgin that's happening, right? Mm-hmm. Complete mindfuck. But also, I feel like a really useful way to think about how even just what is considered a narrative is questionable.
Oh yeah.
You know, where it's just like, you know, the beginning, middle, and end with like a climax, and there has to be a conflict, and then maybe it's man versus self, or man versus society, or like, you know, man versus man, whatever, like blah, 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 blah. And so like that narrative structure is also questionable.
For sure. Yeah. And like time exists in some way, but not in a conveyor belt, but like, you know, mm-hmm. But there's cycles of time. There's like time just as like the like unraveling, like as Saturn, like as like, yeah, like, mm-hmm. you know, tomorrow this will decay, like tomorrow meaning like eventually, you know, like, yeah. there is corruption, there is entropy, and that is time in a way. And there also is emergence, and there's things being born and unfurling, and that also is time, you know, that time overarches all of that, but it doesn't demand linearity other than those loose parameters of just like this direction and that direction, you know, like right. These cultures that have words for, like indigenous cultures that have words for like yesterday, the day before yesterday, today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, but no other time stamps, you know, like anything outside of that just is like questionable, and we have to start talking about it in a different way. Like, you know, the day after tomorrow, 2 days after tomorrow doesn't seem that different from like 5 days before, you know, like they go into the dream space to a certain degree because they're memory and projection, you know, and there's no fixity to them.
There's not a substance really to them.
Yeah. You know, if you did something yesterday or the day before, it's like you're still so attached to it, and whatever you do now is going to have like a reaction. But outside of a few days of that, like things really get shifty, you know?
Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, speaking of time, like that makes me want to come back to like the topic of astrology, because like, totally. Like I really appreciate, I don't think he was the first person to say this, but like John Frawley's definition of astrology, which is the study of the quality of time.
Yeah.
And like, you know, I think like astrology is the thing that helps to kind of, it doesn't materialize it, but it adds definitioning to like that beyond the day after tomorrow and the day before yesterday, right? Like it gives some level of weight to those things. Like even like going back to like how can like tarot do prediction, right? Like as a tool for divination, and how sometimes it's like, oh yeah, this definitely. And sometimes it's like, yeah, sorry, we are getting a do not pass go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
With this particular inquiry.
Or an Uno.
Yeah. Or, yeah, exactly. We're just going to skip this by.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like the like the astrological correlations to how we can comprehend the quality of different moments is really assistive with that.
Yeah, and also just being able to see them as cycles rather than linear, even though they're still, we're still on some sort of like XY axis, even if it's not that square. You know what I mean? Like there's some sort of progression, like just by the nature of the universe, but things are on, like, there's a lot of interacting cycles. And I think the difference in being linear or not is in saying like, oh, well, you're at your second Saturn return. That's the same thing as your first Saturn return and as the moment your birth. You know what I mean? Like, like that it's your, like, if I started thinking about them more as like continents than as like points on a timeline. Like if you were like back on, if you're back on North America, you're standing on North America. And if you leave North America and go around the world and come back to North America, once you're there, it has a quality of being North America and you're back on that place that it exists. You wouldn't say that it's a previous different thing, it's still the same place, like the same with like every Monday, you're back to Monday. Like every Saturn return, you're back to Saturn return. Every solar return, you're back to solar return,
Right. You just
every place on, those are markers, but every place on the cycle, you're a place you've been before,
Yeah. That's so interesting. And it's interesting to think about like the way that the cycles overlap, right? Where it's just like, okay, you're back on North America, but you're wearing different clothes.
Right. Totally. Yeah.
Or like you ate a different sandwich for lunch.
Right.
Yeah. We're here.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of detail shifts, but you're still back. Like, if you go to the store and come back to your house, you're back to your house, like that might be like the moon's movement or something, like you were here really recently, like, but it helps with looking at cards non-linearly, because if we have all these cycles that are interacting and you're on a bunch of them at different points, you can start thinking of time less as like what you're saying about this Haitian literary genre, like challenging linearity. Like instead of being like, oh, there's a beginning, middle, and end, there you could find out that it's more about like just multiple layers interacting with each other, and time isn't a factor or something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, like thinking about layers interacting with each other, and then thinking about like different time scales, like relatively linear time scales. Like for some reason, like as you were saying that, I just like had an image of mica. And like especially those micas, like the lithium included mica lepidolite, and how that will come in like different colors, or like appear to have different colors involved, even though it's all kind of sort of the same substance. Like thinking about a life as like a layered rock, like a layered stone, like a, or even like, I don't know, puff pastry.
Yeah, right. Totally.
Or something. Where like I like the puff pastry idea actually, because then it's like, it's all the same stuff, but depending on where it's at in the layering, it will impact like the texture that it takes on whenever it's put under heat.
Yeah, right.
And
you can focus on a different layer, and be like, you can like kind of switch to a different channel, like, or yeah, like, and I think that's where active imagination plays like a huge role, like where you're like, oh, well, you want this objective, but you're not in that storyline. So if you kind of hop over to this storyline, which might require you changing things that are seeming significant, you're more likely to like reach your target or whatever,
Yeah, absolutely.
But paying attention to, you can't pay attention to every layer, because some of them are like insanely small, or insanely distant or something. But you have to monitor the whole somehow simultaneously.
Yeah. It's brain breaking stuff.
And that's why we do what we do, right?
Yeah, totally.
So that's a pretty good description of a lot of the components. Where do we see divination going in the future? Like, I've been really surprised to see that people who are really into astrology, but maybe they're not practicing it professionally, or less people than I thought are aware of this like shift to air signs that's coming up, like in 2020, and like kind of have a lot of anxiety about the future, which, like, paying attention to that shift of like Jupiter Saturn conjunctions in that cycle doesn't just like alleviate that anxiety. Like, it's not like, oh well, the cure is coming, but it is like, I don't know, a lot of the problems that are happening right now are probably going to really shift and like coming up pretty soon, and it has a lot of implications for divination in general, probably.
Yeah. Oh man. It's so, like, one of the things that I actually think is going to be important is, so there's been like a proliferation of apps of various kinds, right? So it's like, there are the astrology apps, which, that's a soapbox I'm not going to stand on right now.
Yeah.
But there have also been like, tarot apps for a while. Like Llewellyn has like a whole bunch of, I think it's Llewellyn, or maybe it's US Games, has like a whole bunch of their decks available as like phone apps.
Oh, wow.
And like, I have an I Ching app on my phone. So like, I think there's been like a proliferation of digital versions, and I actually think part of what is going to need to happen is like a switch back to like the material version, right? And this is less maybe a response of the like Jupiter Saturn air sign flip, and more around like Uranus and Taurus, like the re-inspiriting of the material, like the revivifying, like the re-acknowledging that the material itself has sentience, right? And it's like, I never really have used like iPhone apps for tarot, but there was a time period in college when I was using Llewellyn Worldwide's free tarot interface online, because it was easy to do secretly in class.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that is that I don't think any of what I got from that app was actually very accurate, or like that online portal. But it did get me to think about like the multiplicity of like archetypal meanings that cards could carry, because, Llewellyn publishes a gajillion different tarot decks, and they have like 10 of them as part of that web interface. And each one has like a different, like each deck has its own set of meanings attributed to the cards, right? So if you pull the Page of Wands from like one of the decks one day, and you get the Page of Wands from a different deck the next day, they'll have different meanings, right? Like same basic meaning, but different like descriptions. And like, I feel like the proliferation of just feeling like there is a knowledge through the digital is going to increase, but like actual knowledge through the physical is going to be more important, if that makes any sense. Like, that's what I'm thinking.
Totally. Oh, go ahead.
I was just like, even thinking about like the creation, like by hand, of different divination methods. Like one of the things that I want to do in the next year or so is create my own Ogam set, for example. But it's about having relationship with object as vehicle for divination. Yeah, I think that's going to be, I think it is important, and I want it to be something that is important. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally see what you mean about like that. The way I've been thinking about it kind of is like that like the archetypes, as we're saying, like are, and this applies for astrology now probably as much as tarot, like that the archetypes themselves being broken from the physical, which they've been in simulation for a long time. Like we read charts on the computer, like as you're saying, you can do like a simulated like computer tarot, but it does the thing where it shuffles the cards or something, and then it draws cards for you or whatever. That like what is probably going to come next with that interface, like it's not going to be what we could classify as a simulation anymore. It's not going to be like, oh, this is like the digital realm simulating the physical realm, and that's like that's like why that's like whether or not like people get addicted to it and they prefer the digital simulation over the actual experience. Like that'll be broken down to like where like what the digital side is doing is just so beyond like or it's like it's so not comparable or contextualized to what happens physically. And then as I think like your Uranus and Taurus is a factor, and then also like how I see it moving from earth sign conjunctions to air sign conjunctions being a factor is that we'll cease to fetishize the material. It won't be like materialism anymore, like the age of materialism. Like material will just be material. It'll like almost like normalize and become like safe, where what gets like kind of crazy is our mental space, like where, oh, this isn't a simulation anymore. It's real. Like it's really happening in the infosphere, and that's affecting your consciousness. And that's where that's where that is. And so we're free to do physical sortilege at that point, but we're also opened up to like new kinds of divination possibilities that are existing outside of the physical completely, that like might be completely, we can't even really conceptualize them yet, but they're, I don't know. I think we're about to face that, like the imaginal world, or what we call the imaginal world, or what we think of as like the interior of our private thoughts, or the interior of our, like, this is my mind, is a lot more porous and interconnected. And we might just start like really taking a bunch of step backs that we're like, oh, everyone has access to that, and I have access to everyone else's. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I wonder, like the proliferation, like the the increase of folks engaging with like plant medicines, like ayahuasca and like mushrooms and things of that nature. Like I'm actually really curious to see how that impacts exactly what you're talking about here. Right? Where just like there being a much broader acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of our brain soups or mind soups or whatever. Whether it be through those methods specifically, or even just like, I don't know, like the weaponization of like monitoring through things like our digital pocket friends.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting.
No, I totally agree with the plant allies piece as like, oh yeah, like, like the cat's out of the bag, like we're all interconnected and you can pretty easily hack that and It's like that's been happening like on its own subconsciously throughout all of history, but for this time period we just kind of like ignored it until it was like a problem or something,
Right.
And that like the that putting up like what we might call in the magical world is like, oh, making these kind of psychic constructs as like walls or as protective barriers, or having spirits that like we put here and here as like for psychic protection that like borders on spatial protection. And we like believe in it and we use it, but I feel like a lot of us still put it in some part of like of what's going on is sort of, it's just kind of a metaphor of that, and it works, so we use it. But I think we'll start to see really soon that, no, that's absolutely true. We need psychic guardians, like, to protect our psyche, and like some of them are going to be plants, because, you know, if you mingle your consciousness with the plant's consciousness, it's maybe a little trickier for someone else to kind of step right into your court, you know, like, or like if you're growing thorny roses around the perimeter of your house, like it's not as easy to enter, you know, like,
like there are fewer ways to enter.
Yeah.
And so they're easier to monitor. Yeah.
And there's like less clarity in what you find when you walk in. You're like, oh, I can't really tell what's the plant, what's the person, you know?
Yeah, totally. What do you see like with like what you call like a reduction in fetishization of the material? Like, do you see that as like a reduction in interest in, or like getting back? I don't know if back is the right word to use here, but like establishing an equitable relationship where it's not about like you're an object or it's like you're an object to attain or get rid of, but rather like you're a thing that is here in the way that I am here, right? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, kind of both ways, like that, you know, if we're rapidly leaving like money being physical, you know, and that's like a big piece. And then, you know, if we don't need, you know, if like everything in like commerce is happening digitally or in that space, like, and not, it doesn't require a number of different reasons, like 3D printing and holographic media and like cryptocurrency and like if things are so monitored, you just get them replenished automatically when they're used up, so there's no excess, there's no waste, there's like less like industrial overproduction, et cetera, like lots of factors that are currently at play. And then being like, if your whole livelihood goes back and forth in like digital space, say, like that, like we no longer need to like think of the material world as where we get resources that like are worth like money. We're not putting like value on each like unit of dirt or whatever, or of like crude oil or et cetera, you know, like they're nothing quantifies to a dollar amount anymore. That will also probably less like objectify one another, you know, and that there won't be, I think we subconsciously, like, it's tied into how we value things. Like, it's almost like we probably don't realize we do it, but we might be like, oh, this friend is worth that much, like, metaphorical money, and this friend is like, I'm rich with this friend or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that, not exactly, that's like really crude analogy, but that the whole objectification will switch, and we'll just kind of start more interacting with our natural environment just as an ecosystem, you know?
Yeah. That's like ecological thinking. This is one thing I didn't mention earlier. Whenever I went to college, I thought I was going to be an environmental studies person. Like I wanted to do like a combination of like ecology and like writing, basically, which I still want to do in a lot of ways. But one of the things that I've been really thinking about a lot lately is like, how do we like reincorporate like innate ecological comprehension? And what you're talking about here of just like, you know, it's like we don't have overproduction because we can have production on an as needed basis, and it not being such a like supply demand falsification of value and misrepresentation of labor and like all of that kind of thing, right? Like that is going into that relationship of just like, if I need something, I go find it. And if I don't need it, then why do I have a surplus of it?
Yeah. Which, like, I know we talked about tracking and like hunting metaphors and in sortilege, and kind of rewilding in general, but then the element of rewilding that like involves like being a tracker hunter, like, you know, those practices are really similar in a way to how we might kind of pick through the foliage of card clusters, you know?
Oh, totally. It's like this is one of the things that I think, like if you're not in conversation with like an entity, right, using your cards, but you are just like going after like a specific insight around like something in particular that's happening in a life, right? Like this is where like the importance of actually knowing what you're asking becomes really important.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess
totally.
like it's important, I think, with conversation with like entities too. But, you know, it's like not every conversation with an entity is like, I have a thing that I need to know and I need you to tell me, right? Like, you know, but if you are going after specific insight or specific guidance, you have to know like what kind you're looking for. That I think, you know, that applies not just with tarot, but like, you know, I find I'm not a super huge fan of just doing like general chart readings.
Totally.
You know, where it's like I can do that and like have someone be like, oh my God, I didn't realize that my stars could tell me this thing that like nobody has ever been able to like articulate before. Like cool, great. But it's so
right, like tell me about me, you know?
Yeah, and it's just like, okay, that's cute. I like your bag.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you actually get something tangible and like useful and applicable when you have something in mind that you're actually going for. It's just like, I'm going to go to the woods and see what I find. Like, that's a great meditation. But if you're trying to like make dinner,
right.
like, you know, it's like, even just being like, okay, I'm going to go to the woods and find something edible is like, you know, that's a pretty useful, like, refinement of, hunting, right? Hunting stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's especially acute with sortilege based divination. Like with astrology, that you do get a little bit of like, and you find that like in the Hellenistic era, you'll get the like different parts of the chart like likened to parts of a ship because it's the stars and it's like your life is on a course and there's navigation and you look to the stars for navigation. So there is a little bit of like someone can walk in and be like, at least with transits, be like, hey, will you just tell me at what point of the cycles I'm at now? Like looking at a map for the year, you know? But with tarot or geomancy or other forms of divination, I'll often, if someone comes in and they're just like, I'm like, what are you wondering about? What's going on? What's the question? I'll like make them formulate a question. You know, they're like, I don't know. I'm just like curious. I'm like, well, if you don't have a question, maybe you're at peace and you should just go relax. You know?
Yeah. It's like, well, why are you here? Like something brought you here and it's not because you're like totally zenned out.
Yeah. Which goes back to what you're saying about like, what are you lying about? You know, like, you're like, okay, well, I'll kind of sometimes like cheekily, like, just not move forward with the reading until we get something, you know, because I'm like, yeah, well, I mean, if you don't have a question, then everything's cool and you don't need to consult me, you know?
Yeah. One trick that I will use, especially if I'm at like an event, like in an event context where, you know, I have, you know, maybe 10, 15 minutes with a person, I'll play, well, let's pick a card. And usually the card that the person will draw from the fan, like I'll see it on their face. They'll be like, God damn it, I did not want to talk about this. And I'm just like, well, didn't come with questions. So. Right.
Yeah, that's a good trick. Yeah. We should do a whole other episode at some point about just like tricking your clients.
Tricking your clients into being honest.
Yeah. I guess this kind of like is a good point to kind of wrap it up because we kind of came back to the beginning, but also I did want to mention like, and this fits into this point in the talk, like clean read versus dirty read, and like when you just won't read and what you do to prepare for reading.
Okay. So what I won't read, so I usually share like kind of three things with folks where I don't do yes or no questions because frequently when somebody comes to me with a yes or no question, they're in the process of lying to themselves about something. Right? Or they're not letting themselves be honest with themselves. And so I will push until we get a question that is actually about like what can they do, or like what would be nourishing, or what would be supportive, or something like that. And actually usually in the process of going from a yes or no question to the supportive question, we'll answer the yes or no and we'll get into something deeper.
Right.
If I was a horary astrologer, I would not have that policy, though.
Yeah, if someone needs a yes or no, I switch to geomancy, or just straight spirit divination. But I'd let the person know, I'm like, you're giving up your autonomy. You're just like, if you just can't figure it out and you need a door closing rather than a door opening, we can do this. But it's kind of like sign the waiver, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like, know what you're asking.
Yeah.
I don't read for someone who is like, if somebody comes to me and they're asking a question about someone else who is currently alive and they haven't given their explicit permission directly to me for that reading to happen, I won't do that either. I consider that spying.
Yeah.
And I also consider
which touches on like in not too long, we will realize that literally is spying. You know?
Yeah, it's literally spying.
Yeah.
And it also means that someone is avoiding what their agency is in a given relational context, I have found. Like they're avoiding being honest with themselves and also with another individual who isn't me. And I'm more interested in supporting people towards honesty than in looking into somebody else's closet without their knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
And then the last thing is that I don't like, kind of like we were talking about earlier, where it's like firm future prediction is, you know, sometimes it will come up really clearly in the cards. But I do always have as a caveat where it's just like, you know, we're asking a specific question, or like we're inquiring about a particular context here. We don't know all of the different factors that could play into how this plays out.
Right.
And you might make choices that, you know, are potentially contrary to what we're talking about here. Like, you know, there could be some, you know.
Right. You could derail this whole thing like right after you walk out, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So that's like kind of my other, I don't know, stipulation of just like, I don't try to do this. And we
talked about like, psychic predictions a little bit in email. Like, I've noticed that people who are like bill themselves as like psychics and they make psychic predictions tend to have like a big following that's almost like a religious following. And then they have a lot of drama around them and a lot of people who like really hate them, you know, like because like laying out psychic predictions, like I feel like I could do it. I'd probably get like, you know, better than 50-50 results. And the 50 that's like positive would be so spot on. And the 50 that were off, the people would be really upset.
Well, what's also interesting is like when you're spot on and people don't want you to have been wrong.
Yeah, right.
You know, where it's just like, just because people hate you it's not necessarily because you mispredicted. Right. It could be that you predicted something that they are not happy that they knew about ahead of time.
Right. Totally. Yeah. Option C.
Yeah. So those are I think those are the main things. And then, you know, like I don't enjoy reading at events when people have been consuming too many inebriating substances.
Right. Yeah. I don't want the person drunk unless I'm trying to put them in a trance. Like I do like some of that, you know, like, and I don't want them really, really upset, you know, and I don't want, the weather to be crazy. Like if it's like a hurricane outside, it's like really not worth trying to do a reading, you know?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever I haven't encountered that context yet.
Yeah.
When I'm reading for someone else. But that's totally true for me. Like if it's thundering and lightning outside, like I have to wait until the worst has passed before I can actually get any clarity from whatever it is I'm working on.
Yeah. Or if the level is like the weather is like a level of abnormal that's notable, like you'll know it. Like if like there is like a freak heat wave, like in early spring or something,
Right.
like I might put a session off a couple days.
Yeah. Or if it's like bizarrely foggy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Like if everyone is talking about the weather in that this is so weird way, I'll try to like reschedule.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And then onto your question, what was like preparing for readings?
Yeah.
Right. So this is it's a little different depending on what kind of reading I'm doing. So if I'm doing like an email reading for someone, that usually involves like a lot more like grounding and centering. Because I'm not in direct communication with the person. So I have to, so it's like creating the link with their spirit swirl from afar, sort of. So it's similar-ish to what I do whenever I do a distance Reiki session. And, it's really just like making sure that the channel is clear and like properly set. And free of interference between me and that person's. I don't know. I feel like spirit swirl is the most accurate real word for it. So whenever I'm doing like a Zoom session, the process is a little different because I will be face to face with the person, even if it is through a screen. And so for that, it's more. I would do the same thing like before I go, like read at an event or before I go teach or anything, which is really just like sitting at my altar and feeling like the right connection, I guess, with my own spirit swirl.
Right.
Like getting plugged in there and making sure that I'm the right combination of like open and protected. Because I find whenever I'm doing an email reading, the protection component is important, but it's not as important as when I'm like face to face with someone either in person or in a Zoom session. Because the like embodied ego is a more clear participant whenever I'm in a Zoom session or an in-person session.
Right.
And what's also interesting is like, I don't need the same levels of like plugging in and protecting whenever I'm doing astrology.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
the chart itself acts as a shield. In a really interesting way that doesn't happen in the same way with cards.
Right. Like we were saying with cards, like any sortilege, like a Ouija board, as soon as you start doing it, stuff is on the phone, it's very explicit with Ouija, and there's like horror stories. Like as soon as you start doing it, your whole life could go off the rails, because something is talking. And even when you're stopped listening, it's still talking to you,
Yeah, absolutely. So like, especially like when I've been doing a bunch of tarot sessions or Reiki sessions, like if I've done even just like one of those in a given day, like I have to shower or take a bath before I can sleep properly.
Interesting.
And it doesn't matter. Like I can do other kind of cleansing practices. But for whatever reason, like water is the only thing that is sufficient.
Wow.
Just to like fully like it's like a full turn down of my nervous system. And I think it potentially might have something to do with the fact that I have both luminaries and Mercury in Sagittarius. And I have Uranus on the ascendant. So I think there's something about like even if I have the good and right protections in place, like the like my physical nervous system needs the calm of water.
Right. Yeah. The coolant system.
Yeah.
And yeah, totally. Yeah. It's interesting. That's like a good point that I feel like we could talk about for another hour and a half. The taking the elements seriously, you know, like I've heard of someone, this might be a famous story, my people might know it. I can't remember who told me this, if it was like some, you know, from some media or if it was someone told me, but they were talking to someone who I think was in like Hawaii, and they were, you know, a medium of some sort, and they were giving some sort of consultation over the phone. And they said to the person, like, wait, hold on, I can't feel you. Your feet aren't touching the ground, are they? And they were like, no. I'm like, they're up, you know, I'm cross-legged on a chair. And they're like, you need to touch the earth. And then as soon as the person did, they didn't even tell them. They were like, okay, gotcha. There you are. You know, like, which is so interesting, you know, and like, but yeah, like in our lives, like it's pretty, it's worth watching how much you interact with like air, fire, earth, and water, and like what you need to get out of it, and like where your normal readout on it is. Cause that's this is like, I could go on in a geomancy way from this point, but that's like, you can manipulate everything from those four things, you know?
Yeah. They're so foundational. Like it's even one of the things where like part of why I really like working from home, wherever home might be at the time, is because I can keep a candle lit on my altar safely.
Right.
Like, especially if I'm in a house that I don't own this house. Right. So
yeah.
I feel like I can't just like leave candles burning. Like there is something to just like having an active flame in a space that I find extremely grounding, if that makes any sense. So yeah,
it's like grounding in a really electric way. Like it's like the current is on, you know?
Yeah,
like it's
exactly.
It's
like flipping a switch, but it's like a well-built switch.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's probably good for today, and there's tons more to talk about, and I'm sure we'll come together and chat about more of it and expand on more of it in the future. But thanks so much for being with me, and any parting words or anything you want to tell people about that you're doing, or where they can find you.
Well, where you can find me, my social media of choice is mostly Instagram. I'm also on Twitter. And I also have a Patreon, which is the thing that I want to build up the most. Because speaking of like going back to the safety conversation, it's like I feel more comfortable having certain conversations when people are literally paying to participate in them. Like that feels like a shield. But in all of those places, my handle is Damashena, and that is spelled DDAMASCENAA. I have a website, which is spelled exactly the same. But you can also go to dianaroseharper.com and also find me there. Depending on when you're listening to this, if you are in the Salem area, I will be teaching a class called Tarot for Radical Self-Care the first weekend of August, and I'll also be doing readings that weekend, and that will be at a space called House Witch that's in Salem. And otherwise, you know, it's like I've been moving around a lot lately, but I am relatively consistently on the internet. So,
is that Salem, Massachusetts?
Yeah, Salem, Massachusetts.
Oh, cool. All right,
City, USA.
Yeah, so maybe I'll see you while you're in New England.
Yeah. No, I am still figuring out what my map for that time period will be, but it would be great to actually make it up to Maine and see you and meet Bonnie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great. We'll definitely stay in touch about that, and thanks very much for being on the show, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Chrissy. See you.
Thank you for listening to Liminal Light. Our theme music was composed by the ever-talented Asa Irons. Today, our guest was astrologer, card reader, massage therapist, and energy worker Diana Rose. I'm your host, Chrissy Pucciere Rapucci, and you can find me at atavisceral.com, atavisceral.com, where I post articles and forecasts, offer chart readings, talismanic concoctions, occult services, tarot, divination, and more.